Darren Cole and Victor Kane, two men from opposite sides of the criminal world, were about to collide in a deadly game of greed, arrogance, and revenge that would shake Blackpool to its core. What started as a daring heist quickly spiraled into a brutal hunt, leaving one man executed and the other's fearsome reputation stronger than ever. Blackpool had always been a place of two very different worlds. By day, it was a seaside town full of tourists, families enjoying the arcades, and children laughing along the promenade. But as the sun went down, the streets changed. The bright lights of the amusement rides and nightclubs covered up a darker reality that most visitors never saw. Behind the busy attractions and cheerful music was an underworld that thrived on drugs, violence, and intimidation. Dealers moved quietly through the clubs, gangs settled disputes in dark corners, and money exchanged hands faster than the blinking lights of the slot machines. In the middle of this environment was Darren Cole. To outsiders, he looked like just another young man from Blackpool, trying to make a living in a struggling town. But to those who knew him, Darren was something else entirely. He had built a reputation as a small-time dealer who was fearless, always willing to take risks that others avoided. He wasn't at the top of the chain, but he wasn't at the bottom either. He had carved out his own territory, supplying cocaine and pills to nightclub regulars, and for a while he enjoyed the feeling of power it gave him. Darren's problem was that he was never satisfied. Making money from the clubs and supplying tourists gave him quick cash, but it didn't give him the respect he craved. He wanted to be feared, not just known. He wanted to be seen as more than a street dealer, someone who could rival the bigger names in the game. His ambition drove him, but it also blinded him. He couldn't see the dangers of moving too fast in a world where reputation was everything and mistakes could cost lives. Blackpool's nightlife gave Darren plenty of opportunities. He built connections with bouncers, club owners, and other dealers. He knew how to charm people when he needed to, and he could be ruthless when someone crossed him. Still, there were limits to what he could achieve on his own. The real power belonged to gangs outside the town, men with connections stretching into Manchester and Liverpool. They controlled the big shipments and handled business on a much larger scale. Darren understood this, but convinced himself he could outsmart them. His belief that he was untouchable grew with every deal he made. By the early 2000s, Darren had created a small empire in Blackpool's club scene. He dressed in expensive clothes, drove flashy cars, and surrounded himself with people who fed his ego. To many, he looked successful, but underneath, his world was fragile. He relied on risky decisions, and his arrogance made him careless. Rumors began to spread that he was planning something bold, something that would push him beyond the limits of what Blackpool could offer. The town itself was the perfect stage for his rise and eventual fall. Beneath the glow of neon lights, deals were made in parking lots and quiet backrooms. Tourists danced in clubs, unaware that just a few steps away, violent men were negotiating over drugs worth thousands. Darren thrived in this chaos. But the same streets that made him feel powerful would soon turn against him. He was about to step into a world much bigger and more dangerous than the one he thought he controlled. And once he did, there would be no way back. Darren Cole's hunger for more money and recognition pushed him toward a decision that would change his life forever. In the world he operated in, information was everything, and Darren was always listening. One evening, in the back corner of a noisy bar, he overheard a conversation that sparked an idea he couldn't let go of. The word was that a shipment of cocaine had just landed in Blackpool, controlled by men from Manchester. It wasn't just another batch of drugs for the clubs. This was high-quality product worth a fortune on the streets. The man behind it was Victor Kane, a name that carried weight across the north. Most dealers in Blackpool would have stayed clear, but Darren's ambition clouded his judgment. To him, this wasn't a warning, it was an opportunity. He began to plan the robbery with two of his closest associates, men who had grown up with him and trusted his instincts. The plan was simple in Darren's mind: hit the stash house fast, take everything inside, and disappear before anyone could react. He believed Kaine's men wouldn't expect such a bold move in a town they didn't fully control. Darren's confidence made the others follow along, though they had their doubts. Blackpool's underworld had heard plenty of stories about Kaine's brutality, but Darren brushed it all aside, telling them fortune only came to those willing to risk it all. On the night of the robbery, the air was thick with tension. The three men pulled up to the stash house in a stolen car, masks covering their faces, weapons in hand. Inside the small house, Kaine's men had grown lazy, believing no one would dare to target them. That mistake gave Darren the advantage. The robbery was over in minutes. They burst through the door, overwhelmed the guards, and forced them to the ground. Bags of cocaine and bundles of cash were thrown into holdalls. The adrenaline was electric. Darren felt unstoppable. By the time Kaine's men realized what had happened, Darren and his crew were already speeding away into the night. For a short while, Darren celebrated his success. He looked at the piles of cocaine and cash like they were trophies of his intelligence and bravery. To him, this was the moment he had been waiting for. He had beaten the system, outsmarted one of the most feared gangsters in the region, and now had enough product to flood the clubs for months. He imagined the respect he would gain, the power he could finally wield, and the fear he could inspire in anyone who doubted him. But Darren failed to see what others immediately understood. He hadn't pulled off a clever score. He had just signed his death warrant. Word of the robbery spread quickly, traveling from bar to bar, whispered in back rooms and alleys. In Blackpool, everyone knew who had been reckless enough to hit Kaine's stash. Darren's ego kept him blind to the danger, but those around him could feel the storm coming. Kaine wasn't just another gangster. He was a man who built his empire on fear and ruthless violence. For him, the robbery was more than stolen drugs and money. It was an insult to his reputation, and insults in his world were repaid with blood. Victor Kane's name carried weight far beyond Manchester. He was a figure who moved in shadows, rarely seen but always felt. To the authorities, he was a ghost, a man suspected of running drugs, money laundering, and violence across the north of England, but never caught with enough evidence to stick. To the streets, he was a legend, cold, calculating, and merciless. His empire stretched through Manchester's back alleys and into neighboring cities, feeding cocaine and heroin into the veins of communities from Liverpool to Leeds. He wasn't just a gangster, he was an institution. Anyone who crossed him either vanished or was left as an example. The robbery in Blackpool wasn't the kind of hit Victor could shrug off. Losing drugs and cash was one thing, but the insult to his name was something far worse. His power relied on fear, and fear only worked if people believed he was untouchable. If word spread that a mid-level dealer had stolen from him and lived to brag about it, his empire would begin to crack. Every rival would test him, every associate would question his authority. For Victor, revenge wasn't just about punishment, it was about survival. Within hours of the robbery, Kaine's network lit up. His men in Manchester contacted their counterparts in Blackpool demanding answers. It didn't take long for them to discover who was behind it. Darren Cole had been reckless, showing off his sudden wealth in nightclubs and bars, boasting about his success like a badge of honor. In Kaine's world, arrogance was as deadly as betrayal. Darren might as well have signed his name on the stolen packages. Victor's response was immediate but controlled. He didn't storm into Blackpool with guns blazing. That wasn't his style. Instead, he deployed a handful of trusted men, seasoned operators who knew how to watch, listen, and disappear into the background. Their job wasn't just to find Darren, it was to study him. They mapped out his movements, followed his associates, and learned his habits. Victor wanted precision, not chaos. He wanted Darren to feel safe, to believe he had gotten away with it, right up until the moment everything collapsed. The Blackpool underworld could sense what was coming. Dealers who once smiled in Darren's direction began to avoid his gaze. Friends who drank with him quietly distanced themselves. No one wanted to be caught on the wrong side of Kaine's wrath. Even those who didn't know Victor personally understood the rules of the game. You don't cross a man with his reach. Rumors spread quickly. Darren had stolen from Kaine, and Kaine would respond in a way no one would forget. Darren, blinded by ego, mistook the silence around him for respect. He didn't notice how quickly people shifted their loyalty, how carefully they avoided his name in conversations. He thought he had humiliated Victor Kane, but in reality, he had placed himself in the middle of a chessboard, where every move had already been calculated against him. The robbery had been bold, but now the real story was beginning. Victor Kane wasn't going to let the insult pass, and Darren had no idea just how far Kane's reach would extend to make sure his revenge was absolute. Darren Cole should have taken the warning signs seriously, but his ego wouldn't allow him to. After the robbery, he behaved like a man who had won the lottery, flashing his new wealth around Blackpool with little concern for the eyes watching him. He swapped his old hatchback for a sleek second-hand BMW, the kind of car that turned heads in the club car parks. He bought designer clothes, wore gold watches, and treated every night out as if it were a celebration of his own brilliance. To Darren, the heist was proof that he was destined for bigger things, that he was clever enough to outsmart the so-called kings of Manchester. But beneath the surface, cracks were beginning to show. His two accomplices were nervous, constantly looking over their shoulders. They sensed what Darren refused to admit, that the silence from Manchester wasn't a sign of weakness, but a calm before the storm. They had heard the stories of Victor Kane, the brutal way he dealt with betrayal, the fear his name inspired. They knew no one had ever robbed him, and lived freely to tell the tale. Yet Darren mocked their fears, dismissing Kaine as a man too far away, too busy, too powerful to bother with a small-time dealer in Blackpool. His arrogance only grew worse as he spread the stolen cocaine into the clubs. The quality of the product made him a popular name overnight, and soon bouncers, DJs, and regular customers were flocking to him. With the extra money, he funded bigger parties, rented penthouses for the weekend, and surrounded himself with people who laughed at his jokes and told him he was unstoppable. But behind those fake smiles, whispers were spreading. People who partied with Darren during the night spoke carefully about him the next morning, knowing it was only a matter of time before Manchester's shadow fell over him. Darren mistook their distance as envy. He believed people were jealous of his success, jealous of the way he had pulled off something others wouldn't dare attempt. He convinced himself that he had finally made the leap from being a small-town dealer to someone the underworld would respect. In reality, he was isolating himself. Every boast, every flashy purchase, every careless move tightened the noose that Kaine's men were quietly preparing. The irony was that Darren had once been cautious. Earlier in his career, he had understood the need to stay low-key, to blend in, to avoid drawing police attention or angering bigger players. But success had poisoned him. The easy money from the robbery made him reckless, and he forgot the most important rule of the streets: the higher you climb without protection, the harder the fall when someone cuts the ladder from beneath you. As the weeks passed, Darren's world seemed brighter, but the shadows around him grew darker. His enemies no longer needed to search for him. He had made himself visible everywhere, a beacon in Blackpool's nightlife. Kaine's men didn't rush. They watched him parade through clubs, take pictures with strangers, and spend money like it would never run out. To them, every step Darren took was a step closer to the grave. He believed he had escaped retribution, but in truth, he was already living on borrowed time. By the time Victor Kane decided to make his move, he didn't need to act hastily. He was patient, and patience was a weapon in itself. He had sent his most trusted lieutenants to Blackpool, men who had seen countless dealers overreach and vanish. Men who could blend into a crowd like ghosts and strike without warning. These hitmen didn't make noise or send threats. Their approach was subtle and terrifying, because it left no time for warning and no chance for escape. Darren Cole, drunk on his own bravado, didn't realize that he was being watched every hour he was awake, and many hours he wasn't. Every movement Darren made was recorded in the shadows. Kaine's men studied the clubs he frequented, memorized his favorite routes home, even the shops he visited during daylight. They watched the people around him: friends, lovers, associates. Anyone who might be used as leverage or a messenger. Darren believed he had protection. He believed the small network of loyal followers around him would shield him from any trouble. In reality, Kaine's operatives had already mapped his life in minute detail. They knew the patterns he would follow, the distractions he would fall for, and the places he assumed were safe. Darren's paranoia began to grow, but not in the way that might have saved him. Small coincidences, a blacked-out van parked outside his apartment, unfamiliar faces in clubs, made him uneasy, but he dismissed these signs as minor threats or coincidences. The confidence he had flaunted for weeks now wavered, but not enough to change his behavior. He carried weapons, yes, but Kaine's men didn't need a fair fight. They were trained to exploit carelessness and weakness, and Darren's arrogance provided both in abundance. Even those closest to Darren began to notice the change. His friends, once eager to join his nights of celebration, started acting cautiously. Some stopped answering his calls. Others refused invitations to his extravagant gatherings. Whispered warnings reached Darren's ears, but he interpreted them as jealousy, as a sign that others were envious of his success. The truth was far more dangerous. Every withdrawn handshake, every avoided conversation, was a thread in a trap that was slowly closing around him. In the underworld, the quietest threats are often the deadliest. Kaine's men didn't need to confront Darren in public or announce their presence. They only needed to wait, letting him become increasingly exposed as he continued his reckless lifestyle. By the time Darren realized the severity of the situation, he would already be trapped. The streets that once gave him confidence now turned into a maze of invisible danger. Each bar he entered, each alley he passed, could hide the men who had been assigned to end him. The tension in Blackpool grew palpable. Other dealers whispered about Darren's fate, and even the local police noticed an unusual pattern of fear among the nightlife crowd. No one would step forward. Loyalty in the criminal world is conditional, and fear of Victor Kane ensured silence. Darren's world, once bright and full of promise, had become a countdown. Every night he wandered through the neon glow of Blackpool's streets. He was being hunted by men who understood patience, precision, and brutality. The trap was set, and Darren was walking straight into it, oblivious to the storm that was closing in from Manchester. The first warning came quietly, almost imperceptibly, but it was enough to terrify everyone who knew Darren Cole. One of his closest associates, a man who had helped plan the Blackpool heist, was found dead in a dark alley on the edge of town. The body was barely recognizable, beaten and left as a grim message. No note was left, no explanation given. But the meaning was clear. Victor Kane's reach had extended into Blackpool, and no one associated with the robbery was safe. The killing sent shockwaves through the underworld, and whispers spread quickly among those who had once celebrated Darren's daring. The warning was brutal, yet methodical, a lesson in fear, executed with precision. Darren himself felt a cold shiver run through him when the news reached him. The man's disappearance had initially seemed like a random act of street violence, but the brutality and timing revealed the truth. Kaine's men were sending a message, and that message was directed at Darren. For the first time, he felt the gravity of the situation. Every confident step he had taken since the robbery now felt like a misstep on a tightrope over a pit of predators. Yet, despite the fear, he refused to completely believe the danger was immediate. He told himself that he had grown too smart, that he could stay one step ahead of anyone coming for him. The nights in Blackpool became tense. Darren moved from club to club, but no longer with the swagger that had defined him in previous weeks. He carried weapons openly now, constantly checking for tails, scanning the crowd for strangers. The paranoia that had once seemed unnecessary now became a constant companion. Even small incidents, a van parked too long on his street, a stranger lingering outside a bar, sent him into a spiral of anxiety. Friends noticed the change, and the distance that had begun in the weeks after the heist widened further. No one wanted to be caught in the crossfire of Kaine's revenge. Kaine's operatives were patient and invisible. They didn't need to confront Darren directly. The fear they instilled was enough to destabilize him. Every day, every night, Darren's mind became a battlefield of dread and desperation. He thought about moving, hiding, changing routines, but each decision seemed slower heavier, weighed down by the knowledge that Kaine's reach could follow him anywhere. The streets he had once commanded now felt like a trap, full of shadows and unseen threats. Even the local dealers and club owners began to act differently around him. Invitations that had once been easy to accept were now subtly withdrawn. Smiles turned into cautious nods. Darren could feel the isolation growing, and with it the realization that his arrogance had cost him allies. The same people who had celebrated him now kept their distance, unwilling to risk associating with a man who had robbed Victor Kane. The warnings were everywhere, but Darren refused to see them as the final act in a drama that had already begun. The death of his friend was a turning point, a clear indication that Kaine's revenge had started. Darren had been living on borrowed time, and the clock was ticking faster than he could calculate. Every move he made from that moment on carried the weight of inevitable consequences. Blackpool had become a city of shadows, and Darren, once a figure of confidence and bravado, was now trapped in a world where every glance, every street corner, and every familiar face could be his last. The night Darren Cole met his end began like any other, under the glittering neon of Blackpool's seafort, but it was anything but ordinary. Darren had spent the evening in a nightclub, surrounded by people who were too absorbed in their own celebrations to notice the tension creeping into the air. He laughed, drank, and flaunted the wealth he had gained from the robbery, still convinced he was untouchable. Outside, the streets seemed calm, almost serene, belying the danger that waited in silence. But Victor Kane's men had been patient for weeks, studying every step Darren took, learning his habits, and preparing for the perfect moment. That moment had arrived. As Darren left the nightclub, the streets appeared familiar, yet every shadow was a potential threat. He walked confidently, his senses dulled by alcohol and the false sense of security that came with being in his hometown. He did not notice the black van parked just a few meters away, engine running, doors slightly ajar, blending seamlessly into the line of parked cars. Kaine's hitmen had chosen the spot carefully, an area Darren had passed countless times, yet it was far enough from the crowd to go unnoticed. Their patience paid off, waiting for him to step directly into the trap. Within seconds, Darren was surrounded. Strong hands grabbed him from behind, pulling him into the van with terrifying efficiency. There was no struggle, no prolonged fight. The element of surprise had worked perfectly. He tried to scream, but the vehicle's doors closed with a metallic thud, swallowing his cries into the darkness. Inside, the van smelled of damp leather and cold metal, the confined space offering no escape. Darren's eyes darted around, realizing too late that he had underestimated Kaine's reach and precision. Panic replaced arrogance, but it was useless. The moment he stepped outside that nightclub, his fate had been sealed. The van sped through the quiet streets, headlights cutting through the night as if erasing the world Darren had known. Kaine's men drove with methodical calm, their silence adding to the horror. Every second, Darren's thoughts raced, imagining escape, pleading for mercy, but in that world mercy was a currency that had long expired. They reached an abandoned area on the outskirts of town, far from the neon lights and music that had once given Darren a sense of safety. The place was empty, a perfect stage for the final act. When the van stopped, Darren was forced out, his movements frantic but futile. Kaine's operatives executed their plan with terrifying efficiency. Multiple gunshots rang out, echoing across the empty streets, and in minutes, Darren Cole lay lifeless. His body was left behind, a brutal warning for anyone who might consider challenging Victor Kane. There was no time for witnesses, no chance for intervention. The execution was precise, merciless, and designed to leave a permanent mark on Blackpool's underworld. By morning, word spread quickly. People whispered in bars and alleys, recounting the horror with hushed wosses. The story of Darren's arrogance, his theft from Kaine, and his brutal end became legend in the criminal circles of Blackpool. Kaine's reputation was reinforced, his power unquestionable. Darren's life, once full of reckless ambition and bravado, ended as a stark reminder that in the world of crime, a single mistake could be fatal, and revenge was always patient, always calculated, and always waiting. The murder of Darren Cole sent ripples of fear through Blackpool that would last for years. The streets that had once felt vibrant and alive now carried a heavy sense of unease. Dealers, nightclub owners, and even casual bystanders all felt the weight of what had happened. Darren's death wasn't just the end of one man, it was a brutal reminder of the rules that governed the criminal underworld. Word spread quickly, not through official channels, but through whispers in alleys, warnings in quiet bars, and cautious nods between people who knew better than to speak too loudly. Everyone understood the message. Victor Kane's reach extended far, and his vengeance was absolute. Those who had once celebrated Darren's audacity now kept their distance. The friends who had joined him in late-night parties and risky deals vanished, unwilling to risk a similar fate. The clubs he had dominated began to operate under a different kind of caution, with bouncers and managers subtly altering routines to avoid drawing attention. Even minor figures in the Blackpool underworld felt the impact. The robbery that Darren had pulled off became an unspoken story, repeated only in hushed tones, a cautionary tale for anyone thinking of overstepping their bounds. The police investigated, but as often happens in the criminal world, their work was complicated by silence. Witnesses refused to come forward, intimidated by the reputation of Kaine and his network. Surveillance footage offered little, as the hit had been executed quickly, methodically, and in a location designed to avoid detection. Investigators were left with fragments of evidence. But the message was clear: this was a professional hit, meant to reinforce fear, not to be solved. Darren's murder remained a ghost story of Blackpool's nightlife, spoken about quietly by those who lived close to the edge. For Victor Kane, the aftermath solidified his power. Stories of Darren's arrogance and brutal end traveled far beyond Blackpool, reaching other towns and criminal networks. His reputation as a man who would ruthlessly protect his empire grew stronger, ensuring that no one dared to test him lightly. Dealers and gang members across the north understood that Kaine's patience was as dangerous as his aggression. The lessons Darren failed to learn became immortalized in Kaine's legend. The town itself changed too. Blackpool's nightlife continued, tourists came and went, and the amusements on the promenade still sparkled in the sun, but beneath the surface fear lingered. New dealers entering the scene were careful to study the rules, wary of stepping on toes they didn't understand. Darren's rise and fall became a benchmark for ambition and recklessness, a reminder that in the underworld, power was never given, it was enforced with blood. Even years later, the story of Darren Cole remained a whispered warning. Parents warned their children against getting involved in the wrong circles, and older criminals shared the tale with new recruits, ensuring that the lesson of arrogance and miscalculated ambition endured. Blackpool would always remember the dealer who thought he could outsmart one of the most feared gangsters in the north, only to pay the ultimate price. Darren's life, brief and reckless, became a symbol of the harsh reality of the criminal world, that in the game of power, one mistake could erase everything, and revenge was not just possible, it was inevitable.